I'll just hold up the book to show you what we're doing. So this Mind in Harmony by Subhuti, what is it? It's called Mind in Harmony, which is, it's such an attractive title, isn't it? Who would not want a mind in harmony? And then the subtitle is The Psychology of Buddhist Ethics, which is a bit more complicated. I'll say a bit more about that, but it's basically a handbook for watching the mind and working on the mind and growing the mind. It's based on a traditional Buddhist system called the Abhidharma, according to a section of the Buddhist tradition called the Yogacara. But in a way, you don't need to know any of that because it's in quite plain English. I personally have found this book inspiring to study and read and use. But I suppose just to say it's one of many versions, but it is an extremely kind of clear, even uplifting sort of manual for the mind. And it is available in the LBC bookshop. So there's not very many copies. So if you want one, do be quick afterwards. This Mind in Harmony, you can, we'll be giving talks, but it makes a very good piece of reading on its own. So yes, we've heard from Kusasara and Akashamitra so far on introductory topics about watching the mind, a little bit about what the mind is according to Buddhism. It gets... we go down to another kind of level with it today because I'll be taking us through a kind of traditional breakdown of the structure of the mind, but particularly going into the ethical significance of some of the things that the mind does. So the kind of weight for our actions and their consequences of different mental states, which is basically what this is concerned with. Very kind of moving, affecting introduction in which he lists his reasons for writing a book called Mind in Harmony, or a book on that subject. I might not be able to remember all of them, but they were to do with noticing a need to go deeper in himself, noticing a need for others to go deeper, and noticing a need for deeper harmony between Buddhists. So even if they got on fine most of the time and did good things, that he'd noticed in himself, as much as in others, a need to understand much more profoundly what's happening in the mind when people live, but especially when they interact with each other. Most of the sort of challenges of life, I think, are to do with other people and our interactions with them. You know, if we think of most difficulties we've had, they'll be related to our interactions with others, which ultimately in Buddhist terms means our mind interacting with theirs, because of course all of our experience is mediated by the mind. You can't have an experience that isn't, if you see what I mean. So kind of looking at something very, very fundamental about the sort of workings of life and of our mind. Yeah, so kind of a little bit by way of recap, and I'll add in a few more things. This stuff doesn't really address the question of what the mind is. Thankfully, I think, Buddhism is actually in the end not that concerned to say the nature of mind is this, if you see what I mean. It's much more interested in saying this is what the mind does. Therefore, here are some helpful things we could do with it, and here are things that will be unhelpful that we also tend to do with it. Does that make sense as a distinction? So the nature of consciousness, and also why there is consciousness, which philosophers call the hard problem, because it's so hard to solve, isn't really this stuff, because practicing Buddhists on the whole, even if they might be interested in it in a kind of recreational way, I guess, would find it theoretical in the end to discuss why is there consciousness rather than sort of nothing at all, or what is mind, because you can't even compare mind to something else, because you can't step out of it and say, here you've got mind, here you've got something else, and I don't know, this one's a bit like chalk and this one's a bit like cheese or something. Because you can only do anything via your mind, if you see what I mean. So you can't say it's like this. You can say what it does. So a lot of these traditional accounts are lists of what the tradition calls mental events. And this system's got 51 of them. I thought I'd just read you some of them to give you an idea of what's in this kind of manual. So I'm going to talk tonight about a list called the 5 constants, which are feeling, interpretation, will, contact, and attention. It's funny, those are in the wrong order. Anyway. And then others include emotional engagement, resolve, attentiveness, absorption, penetration, faith, scrupulousness, contentment, goodwill, clarity, ardour, etc. Craving, hatred, conceit, ignorance, vagueness, and views. And then there are 20 things called the secondary afflictions, which don't sound very attractive. And then it ends, this list, with sleepiness, disquiet, and thinking of, and thinking about. Okay, so it's kind of a rag bag, and that's actually in the traditional order. Subhuti puts them into a much more helpful sequence, I think. And tonight, I'm going to talk about these things called the 5 constants. But first, just another sort of introductory matter, which is something else about what the mind does. So he talks of something called the mind moment, okay? And that's where our consciousness is impinged on by experience as it seems to us from outside, okay? Because that actually ultimately has probably a deluded belief underneath it. But I'll say what I mean. If I'm standing out there with my cup of tea, sort of looking at a room of people, on the split-second level, that's what you call a mind moment. Okay, so it's my consciousness making contact with some sense objects, as they're called, like people, room, colour, sound, smell, temperature, etc. It doesn't actually just mean mental, of course. It means your whole mind-body making contact with the world, if you see what I mean. That's called a mind moment. But the tradition says that they're so momentary and so fast that you can't even say how long one lasts, and that the process of being conscious is a stream of mind moments, a kind of endless stream of these mind moments arising, that you can't really split into discrete sections like that would suggest, like the segments of an orange or something. It says it's much more akin to, if you needed an image, a flow of energy like a stream or a fire. So he's saying that's something simple about what consciousness is doing, is it's experiencing or producing a kind of extremely rapid sequence of moments where something that we experience as interior meets something that looks to us exterior. Is that making sense so far? Yeah. So that's called a mind moment. And consciousness is an extremely rapid stream of those. The reason it's relevant is that all those mental events I was naming, they're what makes that up in our experience, if you see what I mean. So you, apart from saying I'm stood there with a tea looking at some people, if you see what I mean, you can't say anything about that without also describing its qualities and some of its actions, which is what we'll come to. So he says that the mind moment, i.e. that bare illumination of consciousness meeting experience, is inseparable from its qualities, like salt is in water when you've dissolved it. So if you dissolve salt in water, you can't, and you drink some, you can't separate the taste of the salt from the taste of the water, if you see what I mean. So that's basically another way of saying you can't really experience the mind separate from our own mental states, if you see what I mean. You don't have the mind over here with no inherent qualities of its own, and then a contented or bored or excited state over here, if you see what I mean. This is how we know our mind. So they're co-arising in a moment of consciousness. Anyway, it is all a bit theoretical, isn't it? But we'll go to this list, which is fairly simple, and then I'll say a little bit about what that actually means for us. Okay. So, flip chart. Okay. Ta-da. The 5 constants. Okay. The reason these are important, and the reason they're called constants, and the reason we're doing them first, is that he says all those 51 mental events, of which I read some just now, are actually subcategories of these. So this is a kind of fundamental list of things that are always happening in the mind. All right? So I'll just read them. Contact, feeling, interpretation, will, and attention. There's lots and lots to say about all these, but I think what I'll do is just bash through briefly what these are doing and then start to say something about the importance of them. Okay. Everyone sort of with me so far, or do I need to clarify anything? Okay, some nods. Great. The contact is quite simply something impinging on our senses. Okay, so I'm seeing all of you now. That's going to my visual sense. I feel my foot on the mat, etc. It's the 5 senses that we usually name, plus the mind sense, which in Buddhism is a 6th sense. Not in a creepy kind of way. I think it's quite dated now, but about 20 years ago, there's a famous film called The Sixth Sense, which was about a boy who could see people who died. Anyway, it's much more mundane than that. It's just saying that our experience internally is like another sense, like touch and smell and so on. So if I conjure a memory, for example, I don't know, I think of a landscape, or let's say a holiday I went on, my mind sense makes contact with that memory, if you see what I mean. But it's also like, I don't know, seeing something, hearing something, tasting something, etc. Yeah, that's contact. But this is a mental event. So rather than salt on the tongue or something, this is the whole moment of consciousness arising when I put salt on my tongue. Not that I do very often, but you get what I mean. It's a kind of, there's a sense consciousness that arises there. Okay? Contact. Feeling is basically whether I find that pleasant, unpleasant, or not really either. Okay? And that's an immediate kind of instinctive thing. I know straight away before I engage in any rational process, because it's usually bodily feeling, although there is mental feeling too, like joy and sorrow. Those are mental feeling. But it's basically, I like it and want more of it, I don't like it and want to get away from it, or I'm indifferent. So even the neutral one is feeling in Buddhism. Okay. Now, contact, feeling, interpretation. This has got quite a few layers. So at the very basic level, that's conceptual labels for what's happening in our experience, like seeing someone and having a label, person. Even if we don't say to ourselves the word person, it means that the sort of shape and colour and line, and maybe sound and so on, that goes into our senses, we organise into an idea, the label for which is person. But interpretation is where we just categorise it straight away on the instinctive level. That makes sense? And you can tell that this is happening when you misperceive something, when you mistake something for something else. So the book talks about a dead leaf blowing across your path, and at first thinking it's a rat scurrying in front of you. So sometimes, do you see what I mean? You miscategorise, you think, oh, there's a rat. Then you look closer, it's actually a leaf bouncing along. Okay, those are interpretation. But this does extend to what he calls deep interpretation, and that's where we're organising. All we're doing is the leaf rat thing on a much more complex and developed scale, based on our habits of our interpretations before, okay, and forming whole ideas about how life works. So, I don't know. You get already into our actual views of experience here, because it's how we explain things to ourselves. I'm trying to think of good examples, but if you think, oh, people always rip you off in the end or something, that's an act of interpretation based on views and sort of impulses previously that will actually start to colour how you do the shallow interpretation act, if you see what I mean. And I don't know, no one gives change anymore, but I don't know, do you ever have that feeling that you might have just been overcharged for something, or just that slight kind of thing of, have I got a bad deal there, or have I kind of has a little bit of deception gone on or something, a tiny little sort of paranoia thing. If we do that often enough, we'll start to develop a view that that's what's going to happen, and we'll start to look for it and decide it's happening, like we decide that that's a rat running across our path before looking more closely and seeing it's actually a leaf. Yeah? So all of that is interpretation. It actually colours our perception. Okay. Will, that's where energy starts to be engaged in pursuing something that we want or don't want on the basis of the first three. So say we see some food that we like, if you see what I mean, that goes in the visual sense, we feel a pleasant feeling, organise it into a thing we recognise from before and have enjoyed. Will is where we want to reach for the food and start eating it, if you see what I mean. So we start to take action. It's where actual actions begin, if you see what I mean. And attention goes kind of even further still. That would be where I don't know. Say we indulge a particular food really often because we really like it. So we've been through this cycle lots of times and enjoyed it. Attention is where we just start thinking about that a lot and dwelling on it. I don't know, fantasizing, planning how to get more of it, if you see what I mean. Really starting to consciously direct our mind towards pursuing a goal that we want or getting away from something we don't want. I don't know, say I get into doing a certain kind of sport. I discovered climbing a couple of years ago, bouldering. I really enjoyed bouldering. I got really, really into it. So I thought about it a lot. Do you see what I mean? And I watched quite a lot of YouTube videos of people bouldering. That's not just the will to actually sort of do it and take actions and buy climbing shoes and so on. It's me actually starting to allow my mind to dwell on climbing, and eventually, of course, you get a bit obsessed by it and so on. All that we call attention. Yeah. Okay. I'll just pause there again to see how you're finding this. You might be thinking it all makes sense so far, but what's the importance of it, or maybe something I've said's not clear?
Could you just summarise the will again?
Yeah, sure. I'll give the example Subhuti gives.
Okay.
He talks about seeing a peach in a bowl. Okay, so that's obvious up to there, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Interpretation is where we know that it is a peach, if you see what I mean. Will is where we decide I want to eat it.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
so there's some sort of craving.
And I'm going to. Yeah, it could be craving. It could just be an action of, of course, in a way I'm giving quite simple examples, sort of day-to-day impulse examples, but as these become more refined and developed, this could be resolving to do the metta bhavana more often, let's say, because we've had contact with that experience. Or maybe even contact, it mightn't even be your metta bhavana, it might be at a class you were invited to reflect on the benefits of the metta bhavana, say. And mentally and physically through your discussion with others, you make contact with notions of positive development you agree with, if you see what I mean. The feeling from that is pleasant. We'll come later to the fact that it's also skillful, that feeling, if you see what I mean, which I hadn't introduced yet, but you can get feeling, well anyway, let's not do that now, but interpretation, what that be? A kind of reflective experience of seeing, yes, that is a good thing, and this is how you do that, if you see what I mean. Will is where I think I want to do that regularly. Attention is then, again, it's a more conscious cultivation. It's me, say I've been practicing the metta bhavana a number of years, thinking, what actually are the benefits of that? Let me remind myself, or let me have a better discussion about meditation with someone, or let me think how I need to deepen my practice next because it's a bit stuck or dry or whatever. Yeah.
Can will be counter to the feeling, like doing something that scares you?
Can will be counter?
You're like opposite to the feeling, like doing something that scares you.
Yes, that's a good point, yeah. You mean you could decide to do something that gives rise to an unpleasant feeling, but that you've reflected and decided you want to pursue, that you want to do? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good example. Well, actually, the Alex Honnold climbing, I didn't mean to make more climbing references, but I've just remembered that was what maybe that's what was in my mind. The climbing thing, that's presumably like that. Although he doesn't seem to feel much fear. Most people would, let's say. Yeah, okay, yeah.
And presumably, sorry.
That's all right, let's just go there first.
Isn't kind of conceptualizing anything as an event, isn't conceptualizing contact already an act of interpretation?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Actually, you could say all things like religions are acts of interpretation, or spiritual practices, or that's at the much more developed level of interpretation. Yeah. So interpretation is really kind of, well, Subhuti doesn't say this in the book, but this is probably the fulcrum on which a lot of it turns, because how we interpret things determines so much, doesn't it? So yes, that's right. So you could say, well, in fact it's true, that any conceptual system, of which this is one, are acts of interpretation, and that we've got to sort of make provisional use of them for spiritual practice. But that spiritual practice in the end, in itself, has no need of them, if it's skillful and developed enough. If we're enlightened, let's say, it has no need of concept anymore. But even an enlightened being would actually use concept in order to bridge the gap between people and communicate. Yeah. So yeah, very good point. Yeah. All frameworks in the end are to be gone beyond, but we'll probably need them for quite a while. Well, I will anyway. I want to cast aspersions, yeah. Yeah, good question. Did you have something?
I was thinking an aversion would also come under will, because you're choosing to steer away from something.
Absolutely, yeah.
If I decide to avoid chocolate, for example, that's a will.
Yeah, so will is basically made up of craving or aversion. It's also the actions based on that, but trying to get away from a certain experience as well as trying to pull it towards us and make it more likely. Yeah. Okay, I've got an idea. Let's get a few more examples going, because I'm liking the range here. Some of them are very quick and sort of banal, aren't they, like the dead leaf rat, but some of them, like that, are sort of quite elevated. So why don't we get a few more examples going? I think we could split into pairs. So we'll do that in a moment, split into pairs, but see if you can come up with a bit of a sequence here. So call to mind something that you think, where you think you can, all these are happening, if you see what I mean. But the key would be what you've just said, so there's either craving or aversion. So let's maybe focus on that, but see if you can come up with things in your life that you've experienced where you can recognise, let's say, interpretation and will happening, and where you can actually isolate them. Does that make sense as an exercise? Not quite yet? Yeah. So like deciding to climb El Capitan with no ropes, if you see what I mean, or deciding to do the Metabhavana more often. See if you can just analyse quickly with your partner through these 5 things, but particularly paying attention to those 2, and we'll see where we get to. All right, should we just get into a pair with somebody near you, ideally who you don't know very well yet, and we'll see where we go with that. All right. Good. So let's see what's come of your discussions there. And sorry, I forgot to say, of course, that if you're at home, you could type in your own, but hopefully Philippa's told them that already, and she'll wave at me if you do. So anyone willing to start us off with one? We perhaps just have time for a couple. I want to share their example. Yeah.
Something interesting we've discussed was we thought like certain things, like you've got like this inner like instinct for survival. So like if a contact was like, for example, instead of your rat example, you thought it was a snake.
Yeah.
You might skip a few of the steps and you act before you've
Ah.
done some of the other ones.
Okay. That allows me to clarify something. So I've been forgetting to repeat things for the microphone, so sorry about that. Those of you at home. So what's your name? I've forgotten. Neil, that's right. Neil was just saying, if something happens very quickly, like seeing a snake and feeling frightened, don't you skip from contact all the way to, well, will and acting and so on. Actually, these are pretty much simultaneous. It looks like they're a sequence, but you could hardly separate them out. I think you can sometimes just about, it depends what it is. If something's really frightening, then everything happens at once. But you could say that in different ways all of these are happening at once, because if we're unenlightened, we're in some will all the time, paying attention to something all the time, probably performing acts of interpretation, have some feeling, and things are impinging on our senses all the time. So, but yeah, I think if you see something frightening, well, you could say if you think it's a snake, you haven't skipped interpretation there. If you're frightened, that's a feeling. Will makes you want to get away from it. And attention. There's actually two aspects of attention, but yeah, there'll probably be some thinking about afterwards. Yeah. Any other examples? Yeah.
I guess we were talking about, it was kind of interesting, I thought that meditation could almost be a form of attention.
Yeah.
So when you pay attention to something that you kind of become a little bit obsessive about, it's almost like a form of meditation. So the contact feeling stage could be like you see somebody meditate and you act on that feeling because you feel good about it and you want to do it.
Yeah.
But then the attention about meditation is kind of a meditation in of itself idea.
Yeah, I think I follow. So, I mean, I'd agree with the first thing you said, definitely, which is that meditation is an act of attention. Yeah, in a way, that's even almost skipping ahead to something I'm going to come on to. So if you don't mind me coming back to that, we're just talking, meditation is an act of attention. I'll come back to that if that's okay. Quite right, though, yeah. You could say it's a way of training our attention, actually, which feeds back into, partly with meditation, we're unearthing and encouraging and being open to pleasures that we haven't had a taste for before, and usually of a subtlety that we haven't enjoyed previously. Yeah. For example. Greg.
I guess my example was if I know that I have to do work on the weekend.
Yeah, great.
I have the mental contact of imagining doing work on the weekend, which gives rise to a lot of horrible feelings.
Yes.
And then I guess my interpretation is like the injustice of having to work on the weekend.
Good example, yeah.
And just how wrong that is. And then the will it's a bit conflicted because part of me is like just really doesn't want to do it, but then part of me knows that I should do it and need to do it. So there's like these two. So I don't want to, but I do it anyway. And then I guess the attention afterwards goes on to doing it, but then there's some attention in the story of how hard done by I am.
You've got a new job, haven't you? So so the idea of having to work at the weekend, triggering this chain, that's a great example. But particularly liked it where you said the injustice of that, if you see what I mean, which is of course here. You can draw a really complex diagram if I got another colour and drew arrows of all these feeding into each other, because of course that interpretation is painful. It gives rise to an act of will as well, of wanting to avoid the experience, but it also goes to here. similarly dwelling on a particular thing, like, I don't know, fantasising about getting our revenge for that injustice or whatever, or putting it right in some way, anyway, creates mental contact. You know, if we keep rehearsing something, I was thinking earlier, somebody once, when I was much younger, I was at a party, and someone said something kind of really unpleasant to me. And the reason I can still remember it is, of course, I rehearsed the memory afterwards. Sort of slightly, I don't know, sort of embarrassed or kind of painful sort of thing overall. What I did, of course, with it was I kept recontacting the experience, you see what I mean? And reinforcing the feeling, the interpretation about this person, you see what I mean? Who then, of course, became narrowed down to just those few remarks, if you see what I mean. That was his entire existence for me. That was my interpretation of him. My will was not to have that situation recreated, which affected the qualities of my attention. So I think mental examples are actually particularly good ones like that. But yeah, thank you. Let's have one more, and then we'll crack on. Actually, sorry, Brian. Hongxi, did you want to say something?
Oh, I actually answered it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I was thinking, like, can it start with a feeling without contact, but then the contact could be the ideas of a feeling?
Yeah.
I guess.
So whether you can have feeling without contact, that was, and I would say no. But as you're suggesting, even if the contact is of a subtle kind or a kind we haven't noticed, or that has even been slightly unconscious, it will be there somewhere, because that's how a feeling.
Because sometimes you can just, like, maybe walk up feeling down, and then what exactly is that contact?
Yeah. Good example. And I think there is actually contact as well. It's harder to say what it is, but you could probably look at what's happening in the body to start with, for example. Do you see what I mean? And then there'll be some mental feeling. But actually, even an emotional experience like feeling down when we wake up has a body sense to it. And that will be part of the moment of contact. Yeah.
So do you think a lot of time we're feeling confused, is that because we couldn't find a contact? The reason that sparks the feeling?
Feeling confused. You mean we don't know what's given rise to our feelings? Yes, it could be, yeah. And I would say, how do I explain this? It's more like a circle than a line. So you could say that the things we tell ourselves about ourselves are moments of contact. So say I'm extrapolating here now from your example, but say I say to myself, why do I so often feel down in the morning? That is a moment of contact, which will feel a certain way. Literally me saying that to myself is something impinging on the mind sense, which will deepen the sort of habitual grooves of me performing a certain kind of open-ended analysis of my own, unpleasant feelings, if you see what I mean. But I think what I'm trying to say is you needn't look for an original moment of contact, because actually contact is happening all the time. And partly what we do in meditation is investigate bare contact, if you see what I mean. So you know that whole thing where we always say, feel your feet on the floor, your bottom on the cushion, and your body sensations. It's because we're trying to investigate that and just sort of slow down the rest of the chain partly and say, what's this like, if you see what I mean? And can I get a bit of space between any of these links, if you see what I mean? And then, for example, see the feeling change. So, if you have tension in your body if you have tension in your body as you walk around in the day, it could be sort of half consciously unpleasant. If you sit in meditation and investigate, the whole atmosphere of the inside of your body, you'll get a big mixture of pleasant and unpleasant, and something about it will sort of broaden out and get a little bit, not exactly wiser, but better informed. And you'll discover lots of types of feeling, and even unpleasant experience can turn pleasant by bringing our attention to it. So that's just a little something about meditation there, and about sort of opening up this cycle. I mean, like when I say it's happening all the time, it doesn't mean that we're sort of damned to whatever it's going to dictate. Because creativity, you could say that this is a way of talking about creativity, because we can affect this all the time. You know, we can choose not just what we contact, especially with the mind in the ways we've been discussing, but also just what we put into our senses. You know, Buddhism talks about guarding the gates of the senses. That means, you know, only looking at, listening to, dwelling on, etc., things that encourage kind of skillful responses, like generosity and so on, and not sort of just pouring in there lots of sensory input that leaves us feeling kind of, I don't know, a bit kind of squelchy and rubbish and wanting to reach for the next fix, you know. So, one of the things about this that I think I've started to touch on there is the importance of getting to know our feelings. It kind of sounds really basic, but this is to do with actually becoming informed about what we do and don't enjoy and do and don't like, because we can both go along with something in our environment that we discover actually gives rise to unpleasant feelings, or have an idea that something is good for us that we don't actually enjoy, or miss that we do enjoy something. So say, I don't know, our friends do a lot of drinking, and we kind of go along with it because that's what they do and that's kind of our connection with them and so on. You can discover, you know, especially through things like meditation, you don't actually enjoy the felt experience. You see what I mean? So you're getting to know there, well, it will start informing the will in a more creative way. You could also think, I don't know, I mean, say we've, again, been conditioned by our environment only to do that, we'll be missing pleasures. So say like walking in nature or music or something, or a kind of deeper sensory experience that is actually absorbing, we'll discover we do enjoy that even if our social environment has discouraged it. Is that making sense? So we'll start to go towards those experiences more that we start to recognise have a skillful aspect to them. And that basically means takes us further towards positive emotional qualities like generosity, compassion, etc. So you can see you've sort of zoomed out there to a lot of the Buddhist path and what we're doing by coming to a Buddhist centre and meditating more. But there's a particular, there's a further particular aspect and breakdown I want to come to in a minute. What the book is really about is what is ethically significant in all of this. So you've got these 5 constants in this chapter, and then you've got 46 more mental events that are all subcategories, you know, resentment, ill will, ardour, serenity, blah, blah, blah. The real question that the book is asking is which of those do we want to cultivate and are helpful for growing the mind and developing towards the state of enlightenment, basically, and which are not. But not just like these things are good and these things are bad. It's how do you encourage yourself to want to go down these channels and not those other ones? How do you recognise them? How do you sort of stay with the effort that inevitably this will take over months and years, and so on. But there's a really, really helpful little split that I'll introduce now to do with attention that I guess we kind of touched on already. Okay. And that is that simply attention can either be wise or unwise. Okay. These are ancient traditional Buddhist terms, not in English, obviously. But wise and unwise attention. Basically, unwise attention has arisen through what I'm calling an unskillful version of those 5 on the previous page, yeah? Where we want to eat more because it makes us feel, I don't know, a bit kind of comforted and secure, and or we want to play a lot of video games because we want to get away from our experience and so on. You could say that those are unwise attention because they simply narrow around an object of attention and its pleasant aspects and blinds us to the reality by taking us by kind of obsessing us with what we do and don't want, if you see what I mean, and allowing that to rule the day, okay? And that conditioning our responses by feeding back around the chain again and again. Yeah. So with people, you could say that if this is particularly conditioned by strong craving and aversion, the extreme examples here are being really infatuated with somebody and hating somebody, okay? Because in those examples, as you can start to imagine, you're focusing only on exactly what you like about the person in the falling in love example. You want them kind of only to do those things that you like. You kind of block out the things that you're somewhere aware of don't fit with that picture. The attention becomes more and more unwise, and it gets more and more dangerous the less aware this process is. With hating somebody, again, we get so obsessed with what they've done that we didn't want them to do that we are actually looking for them to do it again, to confirm the view, because it bolsters something about ourselves and the world, and it's that separation, to come right back to the beginning, in terms of our inner world being impinged on by the outer world, that is actually, in the Buddhist tradition, the lack of wisdom that underlies all of this. Okay, so the belief in a fixed separate self that is engaging with other fixed separate selves, so there's an in here engaging with an out there, it is very, very demanding Buddhist practice. It's saying that is a delusion, and ultimately that causes all our suffering, okay? Because we want to incorporate into ourselves things that bolster that identity of myself as a person who's got to sort of get by in the world, or even just as an existential unit separate from other units. I want to incorporate into myself everything that supports that and push away as far as I can everything that doesn't. Unwise attention. So to put it in traditional terms, unwise attention is anything that sees as permanent, ultimately satisfactory and substantial things that in reality are fleeting, not ultimately real, and not satisfying. Okay? So our feelings about a person, for example, in those examples I've quoted, they're not going to ultimately satisfy. Okay? They're going to keep us in this separation. They're actually going to entrench it. But the more we can kind of educate and raise up those impulses and instincts, the more that original moment of the inner world, so-called to us, impinging on the outer world, will become refined to an extent that we don't even experience it like that anymore, so that the urge to give, serve others, kind of ultimately give of ourselves, is actually a spontaneously, not just naturally occurring, spontaneously occurring state. And that's what we think Buddhahood is. Or that's what the accounts say Buddhahood is, if you see what I mean. So that's the ultimate goal, is that we're not stuck in that chain anymore. We've cultivated wise attention by seeing reality in all the things around us to such an extent that we, at a certain point, sort of cross over we do in Buddhism what's called entering the stream, which is where the momentum of our practice now just carries us, and we cannot go backwards into the delusion. Just see if there's anything else about that. So, I think that's it. If we remember anything, it's to do with wise and unwise attention, and that to bring it back to what we do, in all our other activities at the centre, when we do something like the mindfulness breathing or the metta bhavana, in the mindfulness, say, we're becoming more and more deeply absorbed in our experience in order no longer to fix it. So we do things like notice habitual stories in the mind, categorise the inner and outer world. We'll become absorbed into our experience to such an extent that we no longer do that. Okay? And it's a very kind of deeply lovely sort of radiant state where we're separating from the world less, and we don't even think about something called breath, if you see what I mean. We are experiencing air coming in and going out and sort of feathery light sensations, but there's this wonderful dropping away and not bothering to think about it, if you see what I mean, and categorise it. In a metta bhavana, we're reflecting more and more deeply that we're not separate from others, so that, you know, that fact of them fundamentally wanting the same things as us is not just a reflection anymore. We see it as the truth. It goes more and more, as it were, into our bones. And then, if you like, even if things like contact and feeling still have to happen, imagine if they're based on that kind of insight, if you see what I mean, that we experience another human almost like ourselves, and at least as important, if not more important. So we're not even at the centre anymore. We put others at the centre and act from that basis, how sort of lofty that cycle can become. But it starts with us recognising what these things are basically like, getting to know contact at the beginning of meditation, feeling what we do and don't like, what we're drawn towards, what we're not, how do we actually interpret things, and so on, and just getting basically a bit more aware of this basic functioning of the mind, and especially training ourselves into the skillful direction and the unskillful one.